Good afternoon and good morning. We're pleased to welcome you to the Office of Housing Counseling's second OHC Basics series, Record Keeping and File Maintenance. So welcome back to those of you who joined us for the first session, and welcome to those of you who are joining the Basics series for the first time. As always, participants today are joined in listen-only mode. So that means if you have anything that you'd like to communicate, you'll put it in either the chat or the Q&A box. So if you have any technical issues, send your message in the chat to the host, and my colleague Kate will be able to help sort you out. And then if you have any content-related questions today, you can feel free to submit those in the Q&A box. And we'll try to get you answers in writing, as well as answering some of your questions live at the end of the webinar. Materials today have been posted online on the HUD Exchange. So if you go to the training page, you should see there our slides and also the handout that we're going to review. And then you'll be able to find a recording there on the same page in about 1 to 2 weeks. If you need a certificate for today's webinar, you can find that in your learning transcript on the HUD Exchange. So you'll just log in there, select the course name, and print out your certificate. In addition, today we will be doing some Mentimeter quizzes. I know some of you have experienced this before, and for others it might be new. We will introduce those throughout the presentation. So when the time comes, you'll go to menti.com and we'll give you the link in the chat and the code that you'll need in order to participate in those. So get ready for that. We'll add a little bit of excitement in the middle of the content. And so let's talk about the presentation today. So we will have myself, Claire Weatherby. I'm a technical assistance provider with ICF, and I also have a background as a HUD certified housing counselor in New York, working on a variety of programs supporting low and middle income homeowners. And during my time there, I actually helped my agency ramp up on record keeping and file maintenance. So I've been in your shoes, and I know it can be really helpful to have somebody to kind of take those regulations from the handbook and expand upon them and talk about how they work in practice. So today we're hoping to help all of you ramp up on that as well. So to that end, we also have from HUD's Office of Housing Counseling, Office of Oversight and Accountability, both Kim Jakeway and Bernadette Hutnick, who are your experts who are going to guide you through this content today. As far as agenda goes, we are going to start with a HUD welcome, and then we will go into our main topic. So we'll talk a bit about record keeping generally, and then dive into the specifics of client file maintenance, followed by some tips and tricks to help you succeed in this area. And then we'll make sure that you have all of the supporting tools and resources that you need. And again, we'll go to that live Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Tracy Fields from the Office of Housing Counseling to give our HUD welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy Fields, and I am a Senior Housing Program Officer in the Office of Oversight and Accountability. I would like to welcome you today to the second training of our 3-part Housing Counseling Basics webinar series, Record Keeping and File Maintenance. Today, my very knowledgeable and esteemed colleagues will teach you the basics on the things you need to know to prepare client files and maintaining compliance within the housing counseling program. As housing counseling agencies grow and new staff join this industry, OHC wishes to provide a grounding in the basics of the HUD housing counseling program. HUD appreciates the determined efforts of counselors and agency staff to maintain records and client files. Agency efforts in this area serve to document the positive impact of housing counseling on consumers and to uphold counseling best practices. This webinar and series as a whole aims to support new staff and open the door to further collaboration between agencies and their point of contacts. So next, I would like you to listen, receive, and absorb the information that you're about to receive. Now I would like to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Kim Jakeway.
Thank you, Tracy. Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Jakeway, the Deputy Division Director in the Office of Oversight and Accountability. Welcome to our second in the series of 3 webinars on Housing Counseling Basics. Our 3-part Housing Counseling Basics webinar series is a perfect introduction for newer housing counseling staff and a great refresher for their more experienced ones. All 3 webinars will highlight many housing counseling best practices and can help you to avoid some common missteps. Each webinar will provide you with the tools and resources you'll be able to use and refer back to at any time. On January 18th, we kicked off our 3-part series with the Financial Management and Grant Administration webinar. If you were unable to attend this webinar, a recording is available on our HUD Exchange website, and you'll find a link for it within the chat box. The last webinar in this series will be held on February 15th on the tips and tricks for using CMS and HCS. This webinar will emphasize the important role your client management system and the housing counseling system will play in your daily housing counseling operation, including client-level data input, HCS profile updates, and 9902 reporting requirements. So be sure to have your 9902 questions ready for that training session. So let's get started with today's webinar by passing the presentation over to Claire.
Thanks, Kim. So our first topic today is record keeping. And as you know, this is kind of broader than client file maintenance. And we have some broad requirements that we want to talk about in order to help you be successful. So first of all, why is record keeping important? One main reason is that this can set your agency up for success in case of a HUD performance review. So regardless of, you're doing your counseling every day, and we know that all of you are doing great work in your communities. So all of this is really about documenting that work and keeping your records in a way that if the Office of Housing Counseling needs to come and take a look, you'll be easily able to produce everything that you need. In addition, record keeping really empowers us to tell the story of the reach and the impact of counseling. So, how many folks are you serving? What kinds of impact is that having? What kinds of outcomes? And really keeping track of that in a systematic way allows you as an agency and us as an industry to tell the story of housing counseling. This includes the ability of HUD to share your work with Congress and other stakeholders to make the kinds of arguments about the efficacy of housing counseling and the impact that it has on actual renters, homeowners, and homebuyers across the country. And then in addition, record keeping, of course, supports the mandatory housing counseling program data reporting that you all do on a daily basis, but also quarterly and each year. So our record-keeping requirements flow from the HUD Housing Counseling Handbook. We have the text here on the screen, but essentially each participating agency must maintain a record-keeping system so that client files, whether electronic or a combination of electronic and paper, can be reviewed, and annual activity data can be verified, reported, and analyzed. So as you know, each agency must maintain a separate confidential file documenting each unique, distinct provision of counseling services provided to a client. In this presentation today, we are only going to talk about individual client files, but as you know, there are also requirements that apply to group education. As a rule, you'll need to keep each client file for 3 years from the date the file was terminated. And if you receive a HUD housing counseling grant, you're going to need to hold on to those files for 3 years following the final grant invoice payment date. So if you're receiving a grant, you want to keep an eye to those invoice payment dates. That tells you how long you need to keep the file. And just as a note, If you've got stuff in electronic form, there's no need to keep your paper copies as long as you have the full information in your system, that will suffice. And then we also wanted to link this back to, all of this ties together from grant administration, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, to CMS and HCS, which we'll talk about 2 weeks from now. We're tying this all together across these topics to help you sort of comply with the regulations. So as you know, all agencies are required to use a client management system that interfaces with HUD's housing counseling system. And this is where the majority of your record keeping will happen, right? So your reporting and the files that you keep should correspond to the clients that you're reporting on the 9902. And then you also will need to keep track of which of those clients are funded under the grant. So we will talk about all of that in a lot more detail, as Kim mentioned, in the next webinar on February 15th. However, for now, let's jump into Mentimeter. So if you go to menti.com and use the code that you see here on the screen, we'll also drop that in the chat. So log in and let us know you're there by hitting the heart, and we'll also drop in the URL here so that you can go directly to the site. It looks like, great, there's a lot of folks getting in there. I see 70, 80, okay, we're looking great. So this is a quiz format, which means that you will only have 30 seconds to answer each question. So I see the numbers ticking up. A lot of you are getting in there. I think we can probably launch the question. So we have our first question is, all of Juan's files are closed and the clients no longer need services. He disposed the files 1 year after the closing date. Is this correct? So your options are either yes, files only need to be retained for 1 year after the closing date, or no, files must be retained for 3 years after the closing date. So is one correct to dispose of those files just 1 year after the case is finished? Let us know what you think. Put your answers in. And you have about 5 seconds left. So get that answer in. Yeah. And the vast majority of you got the right answer. As I just mentioned a few minutes ago, files must be retained for 3 years after the closing date. And if you have that HUD grant, then it's 3 years after the final invoice date. So great start, everybody. Okay, so let's move to our next question. Your question is, Betty is updating her agency's work plan. As one component, she outlines and describes all of the services her agency provides. Is this necessary? Your options are either that the work plan must describe all services provided by the agency, meaning that she would need to update it, or the other option is no, the work plan only needs to describe the main services that are provided. So we're linking this back to record keeping, right? Because the services that you provide are highly related to what kinds of records you need to keep. Yes, and most of you, again, got the right answer. So in updating her work plan, Betty should include each and every housing counseling service that her agency plans to provide. That way, when you're doing your 9902 reporting and you're figuring out which client files need to meet those HUD requirements, you'll know that every client served with those services in your work plan will have to comply with these requirements. All right, so let's move on and return to our presentation. I would love to welcome Bernadette onto the screen to walk you through the client file requirements. Bernadette?
Yes, thank you, Claire. Hello, everyone. I'm Bernadette Hudnick. I'm a housing program specialist with the Office of Oversight and Accountability. And I'm very excited to be here with you today. And I want to take a quick moment to just congratulate all of you who are studying for the HUD Certified Housing Counselor exam, and all of you who have already passed the exam. I want to welcome you to the industry and thank you for the great work you're doing in your community. So my topic is client file maintenance. The general requirements are client files must be kept securely, both physical and electronic, to protect confidentiality. Every client reported on your 9902 activity through your client management system must have a complete client file. Client file elements are outlined in HUD Housing Counseling Handbook 7610.1, Revision 5, Chapter 5. Client files must be reviewed periodically by a supervisor. These supervisory reviews must be outlined in either your agency's work plan or your quality control plan. They must annotate who is responsible for conducting the reviews, how many files, and how often. Supervisory reviews ensure quality counseling. So whether you're conducting face-to-face counseling or virtual counseling, when we conduct a performance review of your agency, we determine if supervisory reviews are being completed and also what documentation you're keeping to support the reviews. Lack of supervisory reviews or lack of documentation is a common performance review finding. So in order to be counted on your 9902 reporting, each file must include a file number, financial analysis, activity log, action plan, follow-up, termination, counseling results, disclosure, funding source, client authorization, and we also recommend a privacy statement. So next, I'm going to be reviewing an individual client file checklist that we would use during a performance review. The checklist can also be used for supervisory reviews, as OHC is very transparent. We provided the checklist to you to use as a guide, so feel free to make it your own. In real estate, it's location, location, location. In client files, it's documentation, documentation, documentation. So please don't make us guess. Let the file be complete and tell its story from intake to termination or reaching their housing counseling goal. The top portion is self-explanatory. You must include the client file number, and this is generated from your client management system. It's the unique number for this particular counseling interaction. The counseling service a client received must be described in your agency's work plan. HUD published the final rule that outlines in part that all participating agencies that provide homeownership counseling shall address the entire process of homeownership. You do not need to provide additional services. However, you would be prepared to explain the entire process. So let's move down to the questions. Financial analysis. It's unique to the client's circumstances, and it includes a sustainable household budget with a comparative analysis of client spending habits to determine if the client's habits are suitable for renting or owning. Next, we have the publications on home inspections. The final rule also modified home inspection material requirements. Each client receiving homeownership counseling services whose goal is met through the purchase of a home or who express an interest in the purchase of a home must receive copies of all documents that requires regarding the availability and importance of getting a home inspection. You must provide for your protection, get a home inspection, and 10 important questions to ask your home inspector. Clients must receive required home inspection materials during the individual counseling session where home buying is discussed, or during group education on home buying, whichever occurs first. The materials will be reviewed with clients during individual counseling sessions, and the receipt and review should be annotated in the client file. The agency's work plan must describe procedures implemented for clients to acknowledge receipt of the materials. The activity log. This lists all of the great counseling related tasks that you were doing for your client, such as phone calls and emails related to counseling, document review, ordering credit reports, contact with lenders, referrals, resource information given to the client, and including, as I just mentioned, the dissemination and review of home inspection materials. The activity log must also reflect the total minutes per task, so it demonstrates the level of service provided to the client and the duration of the actual time spent on each activity. When compiling grant reporting, the activity log can be used to add up the time frame for that particular client for that quarter. The action plan, it should not be a generic form and should evidence individualized assistance with the client's ownerships, issues, or goals. It should identify the client's needs and state what the counselor and client will do to stay engaged to reach the housing goal. So a copy of the action plan must be given to the client. The action plan must document information the counselor is requesting from the client and timeframes for when it is due. Example, if you were working with a client on reducing debt, how much debt, what is the next step, who is responsible, and by what date? Next appointment in 1 month, what date? So now let's join Claire for a quick break and some Mentimeter questions.
Thanks, Bernadette. We're going to continue right on, so you can use the same link and code that we had in the chat earlier. So just switch back over to your Mentimeter and we're going to do this quiz question. Hopefully you were paying attention during our checklist review with Bernadette just now. I'm going to start us off here. And so your question is, Dasha loves gathering info to help her develop a client budget and always provides a financial analysis. Are budget and financial analysis both required to be in the client file? Your options are yes in every case, or no, not every client needs both budget and financial analysis. So as you've gathered throughout this presentation, hopefully a lot of these questions are kind of spanning both file maintenance and the HUD Housing Counseling Program counseling requirements. So does she need that in every case or not? And yes, so a lot of you got that correct. If you are doing a counseling case, you will want to have that budget and that financial analysis in the file for every client that you serve. Great, let's move on to the next question. And so we have Victor wants to make a generic client action plan form and just check boxes during sessions, as many clients have the same goals. Is this allowed? Your options are yes, this saves the counselor time, it's more efficient, or no, actions plans must be specific to the client, not generic. So question here is, can Victor make a checklist form where he checks boxes for the client's action plan goals, or does he have to create a unique one each time? So let us know what you think. And yes, most of you got that right as well. So as Bernadette just mentioned, the action plan must be specific to the client. And I know we all know many clients will end up having similar housing goals, similar actions that they need to take. But the idea here is to have your action plan be specific, have those dates like Bernadette mentioned, information specific to that client for their actions and also the counselor's actions. So when HUD is going and doing their performance review and looking at those action plans in the file, that's what they're going to be looking for. And that's what your supervisor reviews also should be looking for. Thanks for joining for that quiz. And we are going to go back to Bernadette with a checklist to review the rest of the items.
Thank you, Claire. So let's begin again with a follow-up. The certified housing counselor must make a reasonable effort to have follow-up communication with the client within the first 60 days of no client contact. Follow-up is important as it gives the counselor an opportunity to determine if the client is progressing towards their housing goal, should they modify or terminate housing counseling, and to learn and report the outcomes. If unsuccessful after several attempts to conduct a verbal follow-up session, the certified counselor should send a letter or an email to the client to let them know that there is a need for follow-up communications and for the client to reach out to your agency within 30 days. This communication will help the counselor assess if additional services are necessary to assist them in achieving their housing goals, or services should be terminated. A record of all follow-up attempts must be documented. This is again very important as files should not remain open indefinitely. And document results of counseling. Some examples include purchase a home, modification was approved by the servicer. Again, don't make us guess. Don't stop at reporting that the client received a modification package from their servicer, but did you assist them with the preparation of the package? Did they accept the package? We want to hear the great outcomes that your services are providing. The disclosure. This describes the various types of services provided by the agency and lists any relationships between your agency and any other industry partners or organizations. It must state that the client is not obligated to receive, purchase, or utilize any other services offered by the organization or its exclusive partners in order to receive housing counseling services. It should include a third-party authorization. Depending on your agency's method of service, either written, verbal, or electronic disclosure must be provided. And next, termination. Files must be terminated when appropriate and reflect the termination cause, explanation, and date. Lack of follow-up and termination are two other common performance review findings. Funding source. You must show the funding source and amounts to which the counseling activities are attributed in each client file. If you received reimbursement from any other funding stream for this time, you cannot also charge the HUD grant. Client fees. If you are charging the client for the service, you must retain the receipt in the file. Please do not keep a copy of their check. A fee schedule should be provided and documented and fees posted at your agency so that the client is aware of the charges. Credit report. If it's in file, include client's authorization to obtain a report and to share information with HUD and third parties. You must retain the receipt in the file and the fee must be posted. And discussion of alternatives. If the counselor is going to discuss a specific loan product, such as Habitat, the counselor needs to also discuss comparable alternative products with the client to equip them to make informed choices. And lastly, we do recommend a privacy statement. It describes how your agency collects personal information and how the information is used. The head exchange includes an example of how to prepare this document. So now I will hand over the presentation to Kim to talk about file monitoring and tips for success.
Thank you, Bernadette. Thanks for covering all that great information and walking us through the client file checklist. Now, Claire and I will walk you through the file monitoring and tips for success. File maintenance and record keeping tips. Keep in mind that the client file checklist is indeed just that, a checklist, and many agencies are using it to style their own internal list of checklist items that counselors use to ensure file compliance. Make sure you create and maintain a realistic internal policy for supervisor monitoring of client files. Supervisors of housing counselors must monitor the work of housing counselors by reviewing client files with the housing counselor to determine the adequacy and effectiveness of the housing counseling. The supervisor must document these monitoring activities and make them available upon request. In other words, we'll be looking at implementation of that policy. So for instance, if your internal policy states the supervisor will be reviewing 20 client files from each counselor each quarter, then that's exactly what we expect to see when we request a copy of the supervisor's monitoring documentation during a performance review. Again, remember, in order for a client to be classified as counseled and counted on the 9902, the client file must include all the file components listed on the client checklist that Bernadette covered. To help ensure file maintenance success, be sure to assign a unique client file number to every file. Make sure each client file contains a budget customized to the client's current situation, and the file contains documentation of a financial analysis. The activity log must include the duration for each task and make certain that you document all your activity, including the follow-up. For the action plan, make sure it is specific to the client and identifies the client need and outlines what the counselor and the client will do in order to meet the client's goal. Also, it's important that you remember to keep a copy of the action plan in your client files. So don't forget that each client file must be closed out and documented with the date and the reason for the termination of counseling. And lastly, make sure your client disclosure explicitly describes the various types of services provided by the agency, that it describes any exclusive financial or other relationships between the agency and other industry partners, and that it states that the client is not obligated to receive, purchase, or utilize any other services offered by the organization or its exclusive partners in order to receive housing counseling services. Now with that, let me pass the baton over to Claire for additional tips for success.
Thanks, Kim. What I will cover here is some tips that are related to specific counseling topics. So just as a disclaimer, these are not going to be exhaustive in covering every type of counseling, but we wanted to highlight just a few for you here as part of this presentation. And the first tip is to do with counseling related to home ownership. So as you all know, under the regulation 2 CFR Part 214, also known as the final rule, all homeownership counseling shall address the entire process of homeownership, and it must be documented in the file. So what we're looking for here is you've included discussion about the decision to purchase, choosing a home, issues that arise during the whole course of homeownership. So that includes refinancing, default, foreclosure, other financial decisions, and also the sale or other disposition of the home. So in addition to talking about this with your clients, educating them, you're going to want to put in the file, in the activity log, or in terms of the documents that you've provided to the client, to show that you're meeting this requirement to cover the entire process in each of your counseling appointments, or each of your counseling cases, I should say, regarding homeownership. And then when you're working with folks on post-purchase counseling, whether non-default or mortgage default, you'll want to document that you have discussed all of the options available to the client, determined the reason for foreclosure if they are behind, and use those follow-up procedures and document that you have done the follow-up. So this is all about keeping track of the work that you should already be doing with each client, so that if somebody were to come and take a look at your file, they would be able to easily at a glance tell that you have discussed all of the topics that you are meant to, and that you're giving the client all the information they need. So this also carries over to homeless counseling. So you're going to want to, if applicable, make sure that you documented the proof of homelessness, or work with the client on documenting income or disability, and keep all of those kind of case management style notes that you might have in that activity log to make sure the file is complete. And then on rental, some things that you might pay attention to are recording your help with the housing search, as well as your work educating clients about fair housing and tenants' rights. I know in rental, we're often connecting folks to other services that may be related. So you'll want to document all of the referrals that you make and make sure that it's very easy for somebody to come look at your file, whether it's supervisor or whether it's Office of Housing Counseling, take a look and see that you checked all these boxes. So let's jump back into Mentimeter. We have 2 final quiz questions for you, and then we will move on. So get back in, it's menti.com using the code at the top of the screen, or you can use that URL and click directly. I see folks are in there now, so I'm going to start the question. Amit notices a case activity log does not include the duration of time for each activity, but the information is in personnel activity reports, so it's okay. So let us know what you think. Is this true or false? Either it's true and the activity duration only needs to be in one place, so in this case, the personnel activity report. Or is this false? The activity log must include the duration of each activity. Let us know what you think. Does the activity log need to include the duration of time that each activity took? Correct. So you were listening. Bernadette covered this when she was talking about the checklist. The activity log should include the amount of time that it took you to complete the activity for that client. It may also be in the personal activity report, but right now we're talking about the client file. And so when you're looking at the client file, you want to know how long did the activity take for this client. So great job, everybody. And we have one final question. We'll kick it off here. The question is, Tiffany learns that HUD's final rule requires her to discuss the entire process of homeownership. Does this mean that her agency must add new services? So we're taking a variation on the content I just covered. So let us know what you think. You can either choose yes, all agencies must offer services in every counseling category, or is the answer that she doesn't need to add services to her work plan. She just needs to make sure that current services explain the entire process. So let us know what you think. Okay, we have a little bit more variation on this one, but most of you did get the right answer, which is that she does not need to update her work plan. She just needs to make sure that all the counseling services they already offer that cover homeownership explain the entire process. So let's take a look at some tools and resources that you can take with you when you leave today to help you implement all of the information that you've heard. First, we have some general resources on the HUD Exchange. So we have this program guidance page, contains a lot of information about some of the requirements we've talked about today, as well as this link to a collection of frequently asked questions that are related to record keeping. So if you click on that link, you'll find, basically it will bring you to a page that has filtered out all of those record keeping FAQs in one place. We also have our link to the Housing Counseling Handbook and the Housing Counseling Program Regulations. And then we have a couple of resources related to supervisory monitoring. So in this presentation today, we didn't really talk about the intermediary role, but we do have a link here to a quality control toolkit that is aimed at intermediaries, trying to figure out the best way to do quality control for the agencies that are in their network. And then this final link here, supervisory monitoring for housing counseling agencies, that's going to give you a bit of guidance about creating that supervisory monitoring plan, what it should include, and some advice about who at your agency might be involved in doing the supervisory monitoring. So if you check that out, you'll find a little bit more information there. We also have some trainings to highlight. The first one is the first basics webinar series training, financial management and grant administration, which, as we've noted, is available right on the registration page. You'll see a recording posted. And then we have a couple of self-paced trainings, which cover program standards for service delivery as well as record keeping. So you have a part 1 and you have a part 2. It's a bit of a different learning style for folks who prefer to go at their own pace. So you'll be able to click through those and get some illustrated animations that kind of walk through some of the content we covered here today, and then also some broader content to do with counseling service delivery. And then we have also this link to a presentation, which I believe is slides only, but it's talking about moving away from paper files. So as you're thinking about keeping track of all of this information, whether it's in your CMS or whether you have some paper still happening, that can give you some advice about that. And now I would like to welcome back all of our speakers on camera. We have had a lot of activity in the Q&A, which is amazing to see. So let's answer some of these questions live to clarify some of these topics for folks.
So hi, Claire. This is Shauna Marai. Yes, myself and the HUD team have been working through all these questions. So thank you all so much for using the Q&A box. So I have a couple, kind of 4 different areas that I wanted to touch on, Claire, and I'll invite others to add to the answers. We received a lot of questions about the checklist that Bernadette went over, okay? And that checklist is at the same page where we took registration that we've been putting into the chat box throughout this webinar. And it's all the way down at the bottom, and you'll see individual checklist, and you should be able to grab it from there, as well as the PowerPoints are there too. We also had another question about, we had a lot of questions about supervisory monitoring. I'm so glad that you shared with the audience the supervisory monitoring template that exists today, but there are a lot of questions around what was good proof in terms of that they've conducted supervisory monitoring. So there are 2 requirements here, is that you have to have a supervisory monitoring plan that talks about what you are doing as a supervisor in terms of overseeing the counseling, making sure it meets the requirements and also your own standards. And you have to show proof that you've actually done that supervisory monitoring, which a lot of folks said that they would like to use a checklist similar to what Bernadette provided. Anything to add to that, HUD team?
Thank you, Shauna. So that is, when we're looking for documentation, we'll also possibly pull a sampling of those files that you monitored to see, of course, that there's documentation to support it. Sometimes it's a checklist. Sometimes it's a list of files that were reviewed for a specific amount of time. And then we would go back into that file to see that the checklist or something was there, some type of cover sheet that shows that the supervisor did review it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernadette. So many ways to document that you've done the work. I appreciate those examples. So some of the other common questions that we have that have had in the questions box, I think the number one is folks were thinking that there should be an updated copy of Protect Your Family, Get a Home Inspection. They were concerned that had expired in 2021. So I tried to relay some of their fears that not all templates, forms that HUD puts out, even if it says expired, it's still good. So wanted to make sure that HUD didn't have any update to that they're aware of.
So I would just say the most updated copies are in the HUD Exchange, right? So whatever is there are the ones we're looking at right now.
And that's the link that I provided to people. So thank you. And then there was a lot of questions around what pieces of paper the client must sign. Do they have to sign the action plan, the client action plan? Do they have to sign off that you've done follow-up with them? So, I'll just quickly say, and then I'll open it up to all the speakers around, yes, the client needs to sign off on the client action plan, unless it's by phone, and then they're just accepting over email or however your process goes. But I'll just open that up to others in terms of what should be signed. I know Tammy and others were addressing that. Kim, you want to go? Oh, you're on mute, Kim.
Thanks. Now, definitely want to make sure that the documents are signed. And like you said, if it's a video conference or things like that, you would need to make sure that the counselor sends the information to the counselor, to the client, so they can go ahead and either have it signed up or sent back to them as well, so they can keep a copy of that signed document within the client file.
I just want to point out as well, so the disclosure, of course, does need to be signed, right? And as you said, Shauna, if it's not able to be, then they have to document that they reviewed the disclosure with the client. Don't forget the action plan. We look at it like a contract between the counselor and the client, right? Because it should annotate what both are responsible for. So if you can't get it signed, that's wonderful. And again, it kind of commits the client to keeping up with their next task. So
there's also, and I'll just open it up to other common questions any of the HUD team and Claire are finding here. It seems like there's a lot of questions around digital files, digital signatures, etc. So I will go ahead and put into the comment box, the chat box, I apologize, so that folks can have it at their fingertips, electronic signatures and all of that. But we know that many of you are trying to do things very green and also very quick. So anything to add to that you folks have been seeing in the questions box? It was about signing, it was about files, electronically, all of that.
I'm noticing here, Tammy had answered this question, but somebody was asking for more clarification on expectations on electronic file destruction. So this person no longer uses paper at all. They scan everything in. And so just to be super clear, the 3-year requirement applies the same to both electronic and paper. I think we can just view those as being ruled by the same 3-year requirement. So once the 3 years are up, you want to keep them, that is totally fine, but HUD will not expect you to do so.
Okay, great points. Thank you all. Let me see what else I'm seeing in here that are questions.
Yeah, I saw one related to 9902, which I think might be interesting to answer. So this is regarding the point that we made about having a budget and a financial analysis in each file. So somebody asked, would it be okay to not have a budget and still report on the 9902, say if the client becomes unresponsive? Bernadette and Kim, do you have an answer there?
No, they definitely need to make sure they have a financial analysis done and make sure that financial analysis includes the review of the client's income, the expenses, their spending habits, depending on what the client is there getting counseling for. You also want to make sure we have a comparative analysis of their spending habits and determine what they're suitable if they're renting or if they want to be owning. And also we have to make sure we have that household or that budget that's customized specifically to that client. So when you're doing that financial analysis, if it's not there, it's not the file is going to be you're going to get a finding for that one for not having that particular section done. But it definitely needs to be finished. Yes.
And I guess we could hear. Oh, Bernadette, did you want to add something?
Yeah. So also, if you try to put the client into the 9902s without a budget, you'll get a data quality alert, most likely, right? That will say that you have X amount of clients. However, you have less than that for budgets. So it's very important that it's in the client file and it's in your 9902s.
So I think this is where we could connect it back to the other requirements. So if you have a person who becomes unresponsive before you can complete the budget, then you would want to be sure to follow these other requirements or to show that you followed up and you did all your due diligence to try to get a hold of the person, right? And then you documented, well, the file was closed because they stopped responding.
Yes.
Right, exactly. So many great questions. So I also provided some feedback around electronic signatures, and there is a little bit of information on the HUD exchange that you can leverage there. But there was one more question. Maybe it was already answered, so I need to go into the answered box. But a few follow-ups on the client action plan, that if somebody like refuses to sign it, or if they're in a rural area and they can't get signatures or some type of, can they document that it was verbal? What's the HUD team think about those?
Yes, definitely want to make sure you stay in communication with the counselor, and if you can't do it, reach out to your your HUD POC to find out if there's anything you can do. But one thing you can definitely do is just document into your activity log, someplace in the file that you have reached out to the client and this happened. So when we look at that file, we can see the documentation that you have done it, you've reached out to that client, made sure that you've done your due diligence, you've done your any attempt that you can to get that back, but definitely make sure it's documented in the client file.
Okay, thanks for that, Kim. And I did think about what I wanted to touch on. So I kind of wear a few different hats in terms of the technical assistance that I provide. So a lot of folks are just commenting on the 3 years for record keeping. I know many of you are working in other programs such as Home and CDBG, where the requirement is 4 or 5 years. So it just may be that you might have a longer period of time in which you want to keep your files, just to not make yourself crazy. So thanks for some of those clarifications.
I'm seeing here a question that might be nice to highlight. So this person is asking, what does it mean to document activity? So literally, like what would you be doing? I think maybe that would be a great thing to just work in the basic session. What does it look like to say you've documented that you've done something? Say, given out the home inspection materials or something like that.
So it would be it would really be like telling the story, right? So you conducted the one-on-one counseling, and then what did you do within that session maybe? So if you had to contact a lender, if you had to fax documents to the servicer, like what were you doing with the, for the client? Because the other thing about the activity log, remember as well, that you're adding up the time, possibly to draw down the HUD grant. So how much time are you spending on these activities that you're helping the client with, and how much time are you going to use to draw down the grant?
Yeah, so I think like I know from my experience doing this, I also sort of viewed it as a record for myself. So you have a lot of clients, you can't necessarily keep it all in your head, what you've done for any given person. So an activity log entry might be, half an hour. Like you said, Bernadette, literally bullets, called the lender, sent this document, made this phone call. Say it doesn't have to be extensive, but it can just be detailed enough to indicate what you did, why it took that long, and also for your own purpose. Then you go back into the CMS, you can say, oh, yes, I did that already. This is the next step. So that would be my 2 cents to add on to that. Sean, are you seeing anything else?
So maybe just revisit documenting budget and financial analysis a little bit. And also, does the client need to sign off? That came in a couple times, a couple different questions. Like what does the client need? Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
For the financial analysis, so when we go out and do our performance review, we're going to be looking the file for the financial analysis. So we're going to be looking things for like, did the counselor get a credit report? Did they obtain copies of like a credit card statement, or those kind of things that we can kind of look at? They can look at with the counselor, because sometimes they'll say, no, I don't go out to eat all the time. When they're doing this budget with them, they're going, I don't spend any of this extra money on this. And then when you actually get the documents and go through those documentations with that client, you can see and share this information and say that you are doing that. So it's really important to make sure you get a credit report to kind of look at those expenses, the bank statements, all that stuff that can kind of help go through and do that financial analysis with that client together with them. Hope that answered that question on that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. So we are getting also like questions where it's like a little piece of providing one-on-one housing counseling. And as we talked about, this entire series is about one-on-one housing counseling. And this particular session is about documentation related to one-on-one housing counseling. So we're getting a lot of questions around, like, I just do credit reports. I just do one piece of this. I'm just going to remind everyone that housing counseling and the definition is that you're doing like multiple pieces in terms of intake with the client or taking their application, sometimes doing income eligibility, depending upon if it's paired with another HUD program. You're doing the client budget with them, okay, and making sure that they have a sustainable budget. You're doing financial and housing affordability analysis, doing a client action plan, and then you also are doing follow-up. I apologize. This is all defined in the regulations in 24 CFR Part 5.100. And so you're doing all of these things as part of one-on-one housing counseling, not just one piece. And no, you don't need to do all of them in every single time that you meet with them. So really appreciate these questions. I think some of you are coming in from different HUD programs and you're looking at participating in this particular program, but it really needs to be all of those things.
I would like to point out as well, so of course, all the client files that are listed on your 9902s do need to be counseled by a HED certified housing counselor, right? So if you're adding, if you're doing other programs and perhaps they're not being done by a HED certified housing counselors, they shouldn't be in your 9902s, even under all activity. So again, we're going to talk about, of course, the 9902s in the next section. But just to remind everyone that they do need to be counseled by a HED certified housing counselor.
Okay, thanks for that, Bernadette.
Just taking a look at some of the open questions that we have here. Here's a fairly specific question about the disclosure. Does that need to be an independent form, or can it be combined with other program expectations and agreements?
It can be combined. Sometimes we do see, at least 2 disclosures combined together, so that's fine.
Great.
Okay, great. Tammy's working behind the scenes. Thank you so much, Tammy, from HUD's Office of Housing Counseling. Here's one about, this is really good. And Shannon, you've been keeping us on our toes today. So this question is, if the client is coming to me to fulfill a requirement for down payment assistance, what type of comments do I put on the action plan?
So
Go
Go
ahead,
ahead,
Kim.
Burnett.
So first, you would assume that the action plan, the goal is to, to purchase a house, right? So that would be the goal or part of the goal. And then underneath there would be, the budget and so forth. And then applying for that down payment assistance would all go hand in hand with the goal of the client.
Exactly. So it might be saving for a down payment their down payment. I apologize. It's whatever is customized. And I think that's one of the largest takeaways is to make sure it's customized to that individual client. So, and less generic. Save money is not a good thing to list on a client action plan. That's not specific enough. All right. Hopefully we did that justice, Tammy. Thanks for pinging that for us. Okay, so I don't know what your thoughts are about this. We're going to revisit supervisory monitoring. I'm sure this happens in a lot of smaller agencies. Folks, is the counselor and the supervisor are the same folks. What would you recommend?
So you want to take it again?
Sure. So if the supervisor and the counselor are the same person, you have to make sure that, there has to be, you have to have somebody that is going to be supervising that person. So if you have if you're the only person on that agency that is doing counseling and you actually are the supervisor as well, you need to make sure that you have a higher person in that place, like your supervisor is going to be monitoring those files with you to make sure that they're going over the files with you, to make sure that everything is done correctly, to kind of making sure that that client is, or that counselor is following all the requirements that is part of the housing counseling requirements. Everything that Bernadette covered. So if you don't have somebody, so let's say if you're also the executive director, because we do have that. Sometimes the deputy director is the counselor and also the only person that's providing counselor. So you would go to your board and have somebody that in your board that would be willing to go ahead and take over that supervisory role and be looking at those files and doing all those supervisory monitoring requirements in that role.
Okay, great. And there's a lot of folks just looking for like individual templates and things that they can use as part of their program. I'm just going to put in the chat box that there are a number of different templates as well as samples that you can take a look at. I just posted in the chat box the client facing, which are some of the newer e-guides. There were a lot of questions around like follow-up and termination and the client action plan. There's lots of great things there. And then I'll also post the umbrella page, which is somebody asked for a sample client action plan. There is a client action plan template that is there and that you can also read through. So I'm also going to post that umbrella page to go to all the program guidance. There's a lot of material that HUD has developed for your usage. So just take a look at what's there. And that's where you'll find the supervisor monitoring plan too. Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Shauna. I'm also seeing, I think I've seen this question a few times. Maybe it's worth uplifting. Again, when we are talking about documenting the financial analysis, what that looks like in the file.
So sometimes what we see, right, is the expenses that the client states that they have, right? And then on the other column, maybe it's some advice that the counselor gives them, to cut down on, whatever it is, to help them, do better with their, finances, obviously. What we want to see, of course, is their total expenses and, their income and so forth. And we want to see that bottom number. Do they have a surplus or not? And then what advice the counselor is giving them. So that's kind of a financial analysis, and then, advice to help them improve their financial status as well.
Mhm. Great. And
Great
as
advice.
a follow up on that, I think we have a question about if you're working with somebody who doesn't want to have their credit pulled, and so instead you just, you verify income statements, expenses, is that okay?
Well, we do run into some situations where people do not want to give that information out. We need to make sure that there's another way that we can kind of help and make sure we do that financial analysis. There may be other methods that we could kind of use to make sure that we're getting the information from the client to make sure that they can give the client some good feedback on the situation that they're trying to mitigate according to their action plan. So if they won't give the action plan, or the they won't give the credit report, or don't want to give access to it, they can bring it in themselves. I mean, that's one thing. If they don't want maybe the counselor to pull it, they could always pull it themselves and bring it in. Or if it just comes down to they just don't want to do it completely, you want to make sure it's documented in the file.
Great.
Really keeping us on our toes. They just keep coming in. So somebody asked about disclosures. There is a disclosure toolkit. I just popped that and answered to somebody's question. There's lots of great templates, like I said.
Mhm. Also seeing, I know we talked about the signing of forms, but there's some variations on that. So for example, with the action plan, is it okay to document verbal consent? I'm going to list out a couple options and then I'll ask you to respond. Somebody else asked, is a read receipt sufficient? So you sent it to somebody and you got a read receipt. What do you think about both of those, either Kim or Bernadette? Bernadette.
Go ahead. So I think any way you could document, especially the action plan, is fine. Again, it's really, for the counselor to have sort of that contractual agreement with the client. The more important one is, of course, the disclosures. We want to ensure that either they're signed or there's something in the file annotating that the disclosure was given verbally and documented accordingly. So the action plan, I would say, is a little more lenient, especially since we're doing virtual counseling. It's different, of course, when you're doing one-on-one counseling and the person is right there. When we're doing it virtually now, it's a little more difficult to get them to sign that.
Thank you. Let's see. Anything else you're seeing?
Sorry, I'm just gonna, so many people are wanting to know who their HUD point of contact is. So if you are participating in HUD's program and you are HUD approved, and if you are unsure, I think the best thing to do is just email housing.counseling@hud.gov and ask there who your HUD point of contact is. So thanks for that. I see it in the chat and also in the questions box. So please do that.
And also, if you are a housing counseling agency, you have access to HCAs, so you can go in there and your point of contact is listed there as well as their contact information.
Great. I'm seeing a question here, which is not exactly record keeping, but I think it's on the topic and we've touched on it a bit. It seems important to clarify. So there is somebody who is describing that they make many referrals to other departments within their agency, like a rehab department, maybe doing a rehab loan that requires budget counseling for loan approval. So how does this relate to the language on the client disclosure, which is supposed to say that, you know, the client is not obligated to receive, purchase, utilize services offered by the organization? Could you talk about how that interacts?
So we're assuming then that the question isn't for counseling for weatherization, that they're going to use another, you know, another program within that agency, right? So they're counseling them for one thing, say financial management or, you know, post-purchase or something, but then, you know, they do list. So I don't know if they could actually do the referral, but they could list on the disclosure what else they're offering. And then they say they're not obligated to use that. Of course, if the client does want to use it, you know, it is a separate item, I guess, right? So it's a little, you know, I guess it's not specific enough for me, but Kim, do you have anything else?
Well, when it comes to just saying that they're not obligated to receive, purchase, or utilize our services, we just want to make sure that the client understands that in the disclosure that if they go in to see, if they want to have housing counseling, specifically for housing counseling, that's not going to, if they don't have to go to that agency for any other particular counseling. They can go anywhere else for any kind of types of counseling, for like a rental counseling. So that agency is not able to say that you have to use all of our services in order to receive housing counseling. So we want to make sure that they understand that they can just go to the counseling agencies for specific housing counseling, but they can go elsewhere if they have other counseling information, like if they have down payment assistance, they want to go someplace else. It's not like the agency can say, you have to stay with us if you want down payment assistance, things like that. So they can go elsewhere. That's what that means. We want to make sure they understand they can go anywhere.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. So just to rephrase, I think since it's a bit complex, in this example, you've received a referral from another department. The homeowner is trying to get a loan and you're doing the counseling, right? To enable them to do that. So if you're giving them the disclosure, you're basically saying, I'm doing this housing counseling, and it doesn't mean that you have to actually get the loan. You can make any sort of decision that you want about the loan itself. The housing counseling is going to be separate from that. It's going to be focused on your financial situation, and you still have all your options in terms of where to get your lending. And then by the same token, as Kim mentioned, if you need other services, you can feel free to seek them elsewhere. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Great.
There are a number of questions around credit reports. So are credit reports required?
No, they're not required, but if you do get one, we have to make sure we get permission to pull it and things like that. But it is a useful tool for financial analysis. So it's a great tool for us to use. So we would encourage that, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kim.
Here's a question. Is all of this information required if you're not billing to HUD? Kim, do you want to take that one?
Well, if you include it on the 9902, it's you're going to have to make sure you follow the rules for our program. So I don't know. What would you say, Bernadette?
I would say, yeah, I would say yes, because don't forget in the 19902s, you could report all activity or all HUD funded activity. So we do have a lot of agencies that don't receive a grant, but of course they're HUD approved, right? So they do still submit their 19902s. So they still would have to have complete client files, regardless if they get funded or not.
Yeah, so all of the information that we've said here today applies if you are a HUD approved housing counseling agency.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we had others in the first webinar in this series, so we know some of you don't currently participate.
Anything else you want to lift up from the Q&A, Shauna? I know you've been active in there getting answers to folks.
Well, yes, thank you. And we still have 27 open, so I am trying to do that. So
Okay, great.
let's see.
I know we've had I've seen a few questions in here regarding you're working with a client and they maybe drop off, or you've closed the file and they come back. Do you need to open a new file, or can you just continue the work that you were doing in the existing file? Bernadette, do you have an answer to that one?
So sometimes I guess it depends, right? Because you do have to follow up after 60 days of no client contact, and then you're following up every 30 days. But you have to get to the point where you terminate that file. So if they do come in with a reasonable amount of time, you can continue. But it's like, we had talked to somebody yesterday and they were saying that, they could come in a year from now or 2 years from now. So that makes a big difference. But typically we say if they're coming in for the same service, they have to continue, with that same client file number and so forth.
Great. I'm going to flag, these questions are not specifically or related to record keeping, but I have seen a number of questions in here about, do you need to be certified as a housing counselor to do intake and to do supervisory monitoring? Maybe I'll shoot that one to Kim.
In order to do housing counseling, you have to be a HUD certified counselor. But if you're just a supervisor that's not doing any kind of, counseling, then you would not have to be a HUD certified counselor. We do, it is a good idea to do it so that you have an idea of what the program and it involves and what your counselor is doing, and making sure that it's just going to make your job a lot easier if you understand the process, the whole program and things like that. So it's not required, but it would be a great addition for you to go ahead and take that, and that way you can definitely assist your counselor and things like that. But no, you don't have to be a HUD certified counselor.
Great. And following on,
Agree that it's helpful.
Yeah.
Following on the supervisory monitoring path, a number, I think we kind of answered this, but just to be super clear for folks, a number of questions about, is there a percentage of total files that should be reviewed? And is there a mandated frequency for reviewing the files?
Good question. No, HUD does not tell you how many times you need to do your supervisory monitoring. We tell you that you have to do the monitoring, but that's up to you. So when it's important, then you need to develop that policy to make sure you don't set some burdens up to you. So you don't say, okay, I want to do 100% monitoring. And then when we come out and do it, we're going to look for that 100% that you did 100% of monitoring every month. So it's your responsibility to make sure that when you do your supervisory monitoring, you write your policy up, it's either going to be in your quality control or maybe in your housing counseling work plan. You want to make sure you definitely do a realistic policy, and that's what we're going to be using to follow. But we want to make sure you're doing it though.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a similar mindset if folks are familiar with how an audit works. So, your organization is setting up its own controls. You're deciding, this is what we think will be sufficient to make sure that our counseling is quality and our counseling is correct, and what is reasonable. And so, Kim, what you'll come in and do is see, are you following your own policy that you wrote?
Correct.
And do you have a policy? Great. Okay, well, I'm not seeing anything else that is particularly new in here. Shauna, anything else you want to flag before we wrap the Q&A portion of this session?
I just want to make sure that folks know that, Counselor Max and other CMSs, they are not HUD systems, and some of the questions that we haven't answered relate to how your CMS might be pulled together, or what you're looking for, or how you're going to document that you're delivered one-on-one housing counseling. So I just want like a word of caution there. And also there is a great, and I can put this to everyone, we have spent some time on many different aspects of the 9902 in several toolkits that are combined on the page that you'll see here. And so if you're working with your CMS and want to do some particular comparison there, that might help you for some of you that are asking for other categories of services and things like that, that you're simply not seeing in your CMS. Like, you'll at least know what HUD requires in terms of the 9902 there. So definitely take a look at that. So hopefully that's helpful. So I believe, unless there's anything that came in under the wire here, and yes, the recording will be shared. It is something that you're going to need to go back into your learner transcript and go to the session and mark it that you took the course next week. And you will be able to access the recording. I'm going to pop it into here. This is the same link that we have been providing for everyone, where the slides are at the bottom, the client checklist is at the bottom, the recording will be posted on this page. So you can go back and check out the recording later. And to the person who said they want to share this recording with members of your team, that's exactly what we want you to do. We want them to also take this course, get credit for it, take the entire series. Please, that's why this is available to you and for you to pass along to others. So I really appreciate that comment and that idea.
Great, thanks, Shauna. Is there anything that Bernadette or Kim that you would like to add? Any points you'd like to emphasize before we end here today?
No, other than thanks so much for attending this. These are great questions. I encourage everybody to reach out to their POCs if they have any additional questions that come up that we weren't able to answer today. But thank you.
Sure. And I would just say again, thank you, to everyone for attending. And everything we did talk about today is in the handbook in chapter 5. So if you need to reread that as well, that is a great resource. And of course, ICF gave you great resources as well. Hope you use the checklist because it is very easy to understand. It follows the handbook. And again, you could use it for your own reviews, or you could use it for supervisory reviews. And just thank you again for everything. It was a great session and great questions. So I appreciate those.
Great. Thank you both so much for sharing your expertise today. I know folks really appreciated it. And I also wanted to uplift that, yes, like you mentioned, we have that sample checklist posted on the training page. We have resources linked in the slides, and we also have you all as resources. So all of these questions that folks are asking today can also be directed to your HUD point of contact, and you can get that personal service. So thank you both again. And I think we will move back. We have a few more logistics to cover in the slides. So I will say goodbye to both of you. Thank you again. And we'll get these slides back on the screen. So we have a few trainings coming up. As was mentioned, the final webinar in the basic series will be on February 15th, which is 2 weeks from today. And we'll cover tips for using your CMS and HCS. I know there are a lot of questions related to 9902 reporting today. So we are going to hit those specifically in that session. So feel free to come to that. And we will also cover a little bit about FHA connection there. That's not listed in the title. So if the questions about that, we will cover that. In addition, we are having our second webinar in the Energy Efficiency Essentials series. Next week, we will be talking about incentives and resources to make energy efficiency a reality. So the intention there is to provide folks with ideas for how to help clients who are looking to make energy efficiency upgrades to save on energy costs. And then later in the month and in March, we are going to have a 2-webinar series, which is titled Housing Services for Persons Impacted by Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. We're going to have some other ICF colleagues on there to talk about how to identify persons who may have been impacted, how to work with them in a trauma-informed and trauma-responsive way. And then in the second webinar, we'll talk about some of the protections that are available to people who have been impacted by domestic violence and sexual assault. So I hope that you might join us for those in the future as well. You can always feel free to stay in touch by finding us at the HUD Exchange, or you can email HUD at housing.counseling@hud.gov. And I also wanted to give a shout out to all of the Office of Housing Counseling staff who are here in the background answering all of those questions for you. So we had Julie Rice, we had Tammy Dunn, we had Joel Ibanez. Thank you all so much for keeping folks informed and getting them the answers that they need. We are so glad that you joined us here today, and we will look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for tips and tricks on using your CMS and HCS. Have a great day.